Great Britain entered World War II on September the 3rd, 1939. Trying to weaken this powerful adversary, Hitler organized a naval blockade of the island. As the center of a vast empire, Great Britain depended heavily on the supply of food and other goods from the colonies. Now the metropolis was cut off from the outside world. Hundreds of German military submarines, the so-called U-boats, sank merchant ships bound for Great Britain. The threat of hunger loomed over the island. The salvation of the country was entrusted to a division of the British Royal Navy, which consisted almost entirely of very young women. The Western Approaches Tactical Unit, WATU, was established as a wargames unit in 1942, headed by Gilbert Roberts, an experienced naval officer. In this episode of How It Was, we will tell you why the British Navy entrusted the development of tactics against U-boats to young ladies, and what Prince Philip, the future husband of the British Queen, had learned from them. When war broke out, Liverpool was the largest and most central UK West Coast port, the main artery through which the imports and exports crossing the Atlantic Ocean were flowing. 3 or 4 convoys arrived there every week, each of which consisted of 30 to 70 ships. A special service was responsible for their safety, the Western Approaches Command. The Western Approaches is a stretch of the Atlantic Ocean off the UK west coast. In 1941, the Western Approaches Command headquarters, previously based at Plymouth, were moved to Liverpool. The convoys were constantly under threat. Adolf Hitler ordered the sinking of any ship bound for the British Isles, although this violated the basic international navigation rules. The British authorities had to restrict the consumption of basic foodstuffs severely. Britain was not a self-sufficient nation, and eventually its reserves of food would run out, and it would be forced to capitulate to prevent a famine. In addition, the country could not provide itself with any raw materials except for coal. The British merchant ships importing food were escorted by warships, but this did not save them from attacks by German submarines. In the first 4 months of the war alone, 110 merchant ships were destroyed, and by 1941, the bill went to thousands. The British managed to sink only 12 enemy submarines. The Royal Navy understood, from intercepted radio transmissions, that the U-boats were operating in coordinated groups, but did not know the specifics of their tactics. The situation was becoming frightening. A wargaming unit was established at the Western Approaches Command in Liverpool to analyze the submarine attacks, develop defensive tactics, and teach these tactics to naval officers. The management of this unit was entrusted to British officer Gilbert Roberts. Renowned for his tactical skills, Roberts had been a naval commander in the 1930s. The Royal British Navy, which had relieved him of duty when he contracted tuberculosis, called him back to conduct training exercises in 1940. He was upgraded the following year to a task that would prove his tactical brilliance. Roberts' tactical unit comprised mostly of young women from the Women's Royal Navy Service, WRNS, popularly known as the Wrens, the women's branch of the United Kingdom's Royal Navy. WRNS was created during the First World War. Then it was disbanded, then revived in 1939 at the beginning of the Second World War. The fleet did not have enough members to meet its missions, so the non-combat tasks were taken over by women who worked as mechanics, wireless telegraphists, radar plotters, and more. Admiral Percy Noble, the Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches, was at first skeptical of Roberts' assignment, but only until the girls showed themselves in action. A total of 66 women from the Women's Royal Naval Service, WRENS, served at WATU during the unit's existence from 1942 to 1945. The youngest of them was 17 years old, and the oldest was only 21 years old. Roberts' department created a kind of board game, taking into account real-time data, after-battle reports, and information from the Enigma machines used by the Nazis to encrypt messages. The wargames were conducted in the largest room of the top floor of Western Approaches. The floor was covered with brown linoleum, and in the center was a painted grid. This grid was the game board. On this make-believe ocean, the WRENS moved miniature convoys, model British ships and German submarines. Around the grid were vertical screens of canvas that had peepholes cut into them. The screens were positioned so that when a player looked through the peephole, she could see the equivalent of the 5-mile view that the model ships would have from the floor. One team behind the canvas played escort ship captains who had to stand behind their screens and could only view the game board through the peepholes. The other played the U-boats, who had an unrestricted view of the game board. Each side took turns maneuvering, escort ships dropping depth charges, and U-boats dodging under the surface. The U-boats' movement lines were drawn in green chalk, a colour which contrasted poorly with the brown tint of the floor, and when viewed from an angle, these lines were practically invisible, so the players behind the screens couldn't make them out. The British ships' movement lines were drawn with white chalk, which all the players could clearly perceive. This brought the game closer to combat conditions and put the British ships, as it was in real life, in a more vulnerable position because a captain could not know from which part of the sea depths a torpedo would fire at the ship. The players were given 2 minutes per turn to make decisions and give orders, after which a ship or a submarine moved across the field. When practicing movements of vessels, many performance characteristics had to be taken into account. The range of the U-boat's torpedoes, the speed of the ships, their turn speed, the precise capabilities of the escort's sonar, visibility at night, etc. At the end of the game, the players rehashed what happened. The girls later said that Roberts was a difficult man to work for. He was noted for being pushy, stubborn, and intolerant of disagreement. Nevertheless, he was liked and respected by his staff. Here is just an example of a successful tactic developed by Roberts' department. During World War I, the U-boats typically attacked convoys from outside the formation, striking ships at the perimeter. By 1942, it became clear that the tactics had changed. The U-boats were increasingly sinking vessels at the center of the formation. Roberts surmised that the U-boats were somehow sneaking into the formation undetected before firing their torpedoes. Roberts and his team tested various ways by which a U-boat might sneak into a convoy, sink a ship, and escape undetected. Only one tactic worked on the game board. The U-boat snuck into the convoy from astern on the surface so that it could use its diesel engine to outpace the speed of the convoy. The U-boat would then sink a merchant ship with a torpedo at close range, then submerge and turn around to make its escape from astern. Attacks always took place at night when it was almost impossible to spot the submarine. Roberts and his team then developed a counter-tactic called Raspberry to repel such attacks. When a merchant ship in the convoy was torpedoed, the escort ships to the rear and flanks fell back and formed a tight line behind the convoy. The escort ships were to then search for the U-boat using sonar and drop depth charges when the U-boat was found. The escorts in front of the convoy were to stay ahead and move in a zigzag pattern in case the U-boat tried to escape from the front at full speed. Raspberry proved to be a successful tactic, and its impact on war at sea was immediate. Two other successful tactics invented by Roberts' unit were called beta search and step aside. The second was developed specifically to deal with U-boats armed with acoustic torpedoes, which could attack a target guided by sound. The result of using the tactics developed by the WATU was brilliant. By the spring of 1943, the situation off the British coast had changed radically. German submarines sank one after another, while the losses among British ships were minimal. In May 1943 alone, the Navy of the Third Reich lost 34 submarines at once. After that, German Admiral Karl Donitz gave the order to leave the North Atlantic, admitting defeat in the battle for a critical region. WATU coped with its task, but the victory over the Nazis was still to come. The Wrens continued to work on anti-submarine tactics, improving them or creating new ones. They also taught essential skills to more than 5,000 British officers, including Prince Philip himself, the future husband of Elizabeth II. In July 1945, WATU was disbanded. For Roberts, there was to be no formal recognition. On January 4th, 1965, he received a letter telling him that he was to receive a knighthood. But the following day, the phone rang. The letter, the caller explained, had been sent in error. The invitation was retracted. Why the authorities changed their minds is still unknown. The girls from Roberts' team signed non-disclosure documents, forbidden to talk about it for 50 years. Many of the surviving Wrens have described how they never even told their husbands what they had done during the war. The archive material and conversations with some of these remarkable women involved were released only recently. Although Roberts and his team did not receive proper recognition at home, the enemy certainly appreciated them. In May 1945, Roberts, who spoke fluent German, went to Germany with other British officers. Arriving at the German U-boat headquarters in Flensburg, he saw a photograph of himself in the operations room. The picture, taken from a magazine, had a caption: "This is your enemy, Captain Roberts, Director of Anti-U-Boat Tactics." If you enjoyed the video, please do like it and ring the bell so you don't miss new episodes of How It Was.